The bright side of addiction is recovery, and recovery is the great provider, offering hope, healing, and happiness. If you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. And if you have been here before, we welcome you back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or maybe you simply want to find out more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured Bonnie Raitt, actor John Larroquette, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, former NFL player Ryan Leaf, and Thomas Hollywood Henderson. All these interviews and more are available on our website, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery. You're going to meet one of them today, sharing their story, their insight, their path. In this podcast, we're going to meet Tayna Pritt. Now, she's basking in the glow of over 51 years in recovery. Tayna Pritt is a remarkable woman, overflowing with her love of recovery. Here is a quick clip from today's podcast.
Recovery to me means able to be, oh God, who am I? It's like I'm able to be that person who can give back. I'm able to be the person who can listen and enjoy. I have perspective. So I'm no longer crazed or anxious about losing everything. I'm grateful for what I have.
My conversation with Tayna just ahead. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast, overflowing with gratitude for having you join us on Recovery Coast to Coast. Given the vast number of recovery-oriented podcasts, I thank you for listening to ours. Our podcast is recoverycoasttocoast.org. Following 17 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy it and to share it with your friends as well. Recovery is an American way of life. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We'd love to hear from you, by the way. Recovery Coast to Coast, supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest and least expensive, and what's most important, most successful treatment programs in the country. If you've been diagnosed, with a chronic debilitating disease, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, you try to find the best medical facility with the very best staff to treat the condition. Well, addiction is a chronic and debilitating disease, and treatment of the highest quality is essential to long-term recovery. Now, Sundown M Ranch is one of those high-quality, patient-oriented, recovery-centered programs. They have successfully treated hundreds of thousands of individuals and families for the past 55 years. Now, their staff, they're top-notch. They've been together for a long time, which is very important, and they're very well paid. Many of them actually went through Sundown Ranch and are now in long-term recovery. Plus, the treatment protocol at Sundown is individual to each patient, and their rates, well, they're among the lowest in the country because they're a not-for-profit, not for financial profit organization. Their bottom line is recovery. They own their own land at the mouth of the beautiful Yakima River Canyon in central Washington, not far from Seattle. A gorgeous location. Don't be misled by fancy, high-priced, flashing advertising from some of the other treatment centers around. Sundown is not a getaway resort. It's a well-respected facility, a medical facility that treats the disease of addiction. Now, they are abstinence-based. They are 12-step centered. And you can find out more about this highly successful treatment program, as well as checking out their facility. You can do that at sundown.org. Sundown, it's where recovery begins. Sundown.org. All right, as I pour a cup of dark roast coffee for myself, I invite you to share your favorite non-alcoholic beverage and listen to my conversation with Tayna Pritt. She's a woman who embodies the miracle of recovery. I started off by asking her about her drug usage early on.
I used methadone, basically, back in the, can't even remember, but over 51 years ago.
Holy
I quit.
Smokes, 51 years
ago? I
ago?
quit use. Yeah, I have 51 in almost a half year. So my sobriety date is 7/21/1972.
72, all right.
It was before I had children, and so my sons never saw me using drugs or anything like that. I quit on my own. I had a boyfriend who used to shoot reds, and I did methadone, and God knows what we had in common. We both worked in a restaurant. One night, he overdosed and fell over, and it was one of those Denny's-style restaurants where you could see through the window, and there was a cook, and all of a sudden there wasn't a cook. And so the other waitress, Nancy, and I went around to the kitchen, and we dragged him off to a banquet room. And then we came back, and because she and I both were old school then in our work ethic, I knew how to cook, so I became the cook that night, and she was the waitress. And we got done with everything, and I was in the bathroom cleaning up at the end of the night, and I was looking in the mirror, and I thought, my God, Tanya, you look old. And I knew what that was from. I was 6 foot tall, and I weighed about 110, so I did look like death warmed over. And I said, I got to quit. And I quit using that night. So as Nancy and I were talking about me quitting using and this and that, and she was kind of a normal person. She didn't use drugs. She just was that normie. And we both looked at each other at one point and we said, oh my God, Toby, where is he? Remembering we had drugged this
the
guy
cook. What happened to the cook?
The banquet room. So a couple of things happened that night. We went back. We kind of roused him, slapped him a couple times, yelled at him, and he came around. So that was cool. What wasn't cool was I was already pregnant, and so I left him. And so didn't leave him in the banquet room, but drove him home. So,
oh, my goodness.
That set a bunch of different things in motion, and I never quit using, but my life didn't really get better. So fast forward almost 10 years, I'm in school because I had become a bartender, and I didn't want to tend bar my whole life. So I'm going to school at Seattle University, and I had to talk my way into that school. But they forwarded me to do an internship at a place called Pioneer Human Services. Well, I worked there for 3 years or so. I ended up working in all of the cottages, not only the Veterans Cottage where I took histories, and I don't know why they even talked to me, and then in the adolescent cottages. And then I had the pleasure of taking people to a meeting that was up in the dining room. And I'd never been to a 12-step meeting in my life. And no, I'm hanging on. I've never used. I have almost 10 years clean. And I went to the meeting, and I sat kind of in the back, but where I could read the stuff on the wall. And I read and reread the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. And I thought to myself, my God, there's a plan, and it's not rocket science. There's a plan. From then on, I took the men to the meeting 2 or 3 times a week. I always sat in that same place. Today, when I go to my home group, I sit in the same place, another room. It's in a church, but it's across from the 12 steps, 12 traditions, and the 11th step prayer, which is sort of my meditation. And I read it, and I read it, and I read it. And my brain is so feeble, I can't memorize it anymore, but I read it and read it. And the meeting gives me strength, and the reading gives me strength. Because the work is hard. If you work in this field, the work is hard. That's when I had started going to some AA meetings and this and that. And so my recovery was kind of born at that 10-year of abstinence. And I've never looked back.
You mentioned Seattle U. I have a strong feeling that we have a friend in common who's since passed away, Father Jim Royce.
Oh, yes. I have a funny story about him. I'm a high school dropout, and I went back about 10 years later and got my GED. And then I went to see Father Royce. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to maybe become a drug and alcohol person. I was tending bar. I thought, at that time, how much different can it be? Same group of people, different message, right? And so I went and I talked my way in, and he said, Tanya, I'll give you a chance, but you've got 1 quarter to prove yourself because we don't take GEDs here. Wow. I said, okay. So I took 22 credits because I throw myself in all the way, and I struggled with pharmacology. And I ended up getting an A in most of my classes, which was the agreement, but I got a C in pharmacology. And I went in, I didn't know it yet, and they had the grades in kind of a folder where you could find your name and pull out and get your grades. And Father Royce was there, and he was standing up, and he had a newspaper in his hand, and he had it up in front of his face. And I said, hi, Father Royce. And he puts it down. He goes, hello. And I pulled out my grades, and I saw the C, and I thought, oh, my God, he's going to make me quit. And I said, I'm so sorry. I thought I would do better. And he goes, so did I, Tanya. And he puts the paper up. I'm thinking, I'm dying, What's going to happen here? And then he put the paper down. He said, keep up the good work. And I thought, wow, I'm in. It was a wonderful time. I only completed a little over 3 years, taking 22 credits, but then I fell. And so some things happened kind of all at once. I fell, tore my knee open, had surgery, was on crutches. And if you remember Seattle University, you're kind of going up and down hills on the campus.
Yeah.
I could not manage. I also had got married, one of the bad decisions I made in recovery, and I moved to Roseburg, Oregon. So I never did finish college. And I was in a marriage that was going to go by the wayside anyway, but I never used again. I look back, they go, well, Tanya, how'd you do that? Didn't you have cravings? Yeah, probably the first 3 months. I kind of had whips and jangles because I was just body regulating itself to normalcy. But I never used, and I knew I wouldn't. And the reason I knew I wouldn't is that I made a decision. I talk to people about, a lot of people struggle in early recovery, but it seems that when they make that decision, things get a little easier. It's sort of like try to pick up the pencil. No, pick up the pencil.
What was life like in Roseburg with a new husband and still in recovery?
Well, it was kind of interesting. He was Mr. AA unless he was Mr. NA. And so he had this shtick, and he would get called on and everybody wanted to be him and be like him. And I knew when we were at home, he was stark raving nuts. And so it wasn't good at home, but I would go to meetings with him, and I had up in the Seattle area. We had some favorite meetings in the Seattle area because he was so well behaved in a meeting, unless he was being entertaining. And even then, everybody just loved him. Well, when he died a few years ago, and we were friendly when he died. We weren't married any longer, but we were friendly because I saw him for who he was. He knew I saw him for who he was. And there just wasn't anything to lie about anymore. So why not? And we had kids. Roseburg was an interesting place. I was there for 6 years, and I opened an adolescent treatment center for ADAPT after packaging the program in big boxes. It was all paper then. I shipped it everywhere, including to my current employer, where I then later joined and went to work 32 years ago. I've been in the field over 40, the last 32 years with my employer in Corvallis.
Back to the using years, tell me about the first time you used meth. What were the circumstances and what attracted you?
Well, it was pharmaceuticals, so it was pills. I had kind of a crazy childhood, and I got married the first time. I wasn't even 18 yet. I was 17. And he wasn't 21 yet. He was 20. Both of our parents had to sign for us. Got married, and it was sort of the beginning of sort of a list of husbands that didn't work or that didn't work and support the family or me or whatever. I was working 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs, and I couldn't stay awake. And my name at the time was White, was my last name. And this man named David Black, I'll never forget him. We lived kind of close together, and he said, Tanya, I got something that'll help you stay awake. And I said, really? And I was kind of stupid. I'd smoked pot a half a dozen times, but I didn't like it because it made me stupid. Alcohol was never my friend. I took the pills, and I said, well, I'll take it now. And he handed me some water or something, and I took them all. And he'd given me about 10 pills.
You took 10 pills?
Well, let me tell you, yeah. So let me tell you, I was flying.
You were awake for a while.
Awake for a while, yeah. And then I kind of thought that was what I should take. So that was sort of became a usual dose. I worked. That's all I ever did was I worked. I worked a lot. I ended up moving down to LA, and I was working at this place called the Across the Street Restaurant. And it was a place where customers would come in and take a seat at the table and then call you from a phone, and you would take the order, get it ready, and then deliver it. So I was doing the work of probably 2 or 3 people going crazy, and my boss fired me after I'd been doing this a few months. And I said, why? I'm doing such a good job. He said, Tanya, he said, I don't know how you're doing a good job. He said, but you're going to have a heart attack. And he said, I can't have that happen here.
Oh, my.
I was skinny beyond words. I was higher than a kite, buzzing around. So I kind of felt sorry for myself for a few hours and went and got another job. So jobs were pretty easy to come by. I always tell people back then I was young and tender and full of surrender. So I easily got a job with my blonde-haired, blue-eyed self. And the same thing. I married 2, 3, 4 times, and it was all bad. I picked bad. So,
But you maintained your recovery through it all.
Through it all, because I had made that decision, and I was not going to go back on it, and I didn't have to. That was, I'm trying to think how shortly after the incident when I got fired was the next job was at Copper Penny was the name of the restaurant in Van Nuys, where I had the husband, where I quit. I don't know how I didn't make mistakes, like with money or things like that, because I certainly was thinking faster than I could keep up with myself. And then it was shortly after that I went home one night after work, and I found my then boyfriend in bed with my friend. And I told her, I said, get your shit and get in the car. She got in the car, and she's scared, and I'm a little scared because what am I going to do? And I said, where do you live? And she said, Vancouver, BC. And I said, okay, I'm taking you home. So that's how I ended up in Seattle. Was by the time I got back into Seattle, I had probably $3 in my pocket, and I needed a job. And of course, I don't have family or anything. So there was a place in the industrial area called the Jet Drive-In. I pulled in there. It was like a hamburger drive-in, and I saw a help wanted sign in the window. So I walked up, I grabbed the sign out of the open window, walked around to the back door, and I walked in there, and there was a man, probably 300 pounds. His name was Cecil, and he was sitting on a chair. And I said, hi. I said, you need help and I need a job. And he said, well, are you hungry? And I said, I'll wait till after I work, because my dad taught me right. So you work first, you eat later. And so by the time I got done working and I cleaned everything, and unbeknownst to all of us, I was already pregnant. But I talked to him, and he said, do you have a place to live? And I said, I don't. And he said, okay. And he handed me $100 bill. And he said, you're going to go straight up this street. And I went straight up the street to a trailer park. And he'd already arranged to have a trailer rented for me. And he said, be here tomorrow at whatever time it was. And I thought, oh my God, I just met the kindest man in the world. That's what I did. And I worked for him. And, people have helped me along the way. I know that's my energy source, if you will. Mm-hmm. Working in the field is people have helped me. They weren't all rocket scientists. I don't need to be, and I can help people. Here I am in my position, probably the only one in Oregon in my level of a position that doesn't have a degree. I don't have a degree, yet I have been directing programs for almost 40 years.
You've been in recovery for 51 years.
51, yeah.
Take us to present day for Tanya. What is life like for you? What is recovery like for you? And I know that you work with a lot of ladies down there in Oregon.
I do. I manage Milestones. It's Family Recovery Inc. And I take care of the women's programs, residential and outpatient. I absolutely love it. I used to take care of also a kids program, adolescent program, but that closed about little over 2 years ago. Just focused on the women. And what has been the most exciting is, managed care has bit me in the backside a couple times. The first time was when we couldn't get treatment authorized for men. So when the last man left a co-ed place, the women's program took over, and I took over. Well, then it hit again, and we weren't getting the referrals we needed. And this goes back almost 20 years ago. And I met with the owner. It's a family-owned business. I am not family. And she said, we're thinking about shutting it down, Tanya. We just don't know if we can keep it open. And I said, well, give me 2 weeks. Let me see what I can do. Because I always think there's a good answer somewhere. I just have to find it. So I had done a little bit of work with the tribes, Warm Springs. And so I called Indian Health Services, and I knew the person who worked there. And I just said, hey, I don't know if this is harebrained or not, but you have NARA in Oregon. It's the only native program in Oregon at that time. And she said, yes. And I said, you have some people that would rather not go to NARA. And she said, that's true. And I said, what if I work hard to learn what I need to do to become kind of a native, not necessarily native specific, but native welcoming, and insert practices and ceremony and disciplines and learnings that will support Native American women. She said, okay. So she put me in touch with Warm Springs Counseling Center. And so I went and I talked with them. By the end of 2 weeks, I had 8 referrals in, and the women were in and working, and their little children. Well, that saved our bacon. What I've developed with all the help in the world, including Warm Springs, is we have a minority license. We work well and hard with Native people. We've added things like talking circles, healing circles, variety. We do smudging. There's smudging going on every day. I love it. It sort of takes, I don't want to say it takes the educated best practice jargon out. That's not a politically correct thing to say.
I understand.
But it has infused a trauma responsive ethic. And the women who have come in there are so hurting, have had such deep levels of trauma and historical trauma, multi-generational trauma, and we start to healing, and we have got great outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean everybody that comes in stays clean and sober, because that just isn't true in any group. But the women who come in are respected and cared for. And just recently, I had a woman who had been in our program 2 years ago who did well. And she was an educated woman, which is kind of she ran a program in Warm Springs for children, but she had gone back out drinking, and she was living in her car. And she texted me, because every woman that comes in treatment from that area, they leave with my phone number so that they can text me. I always say, text me the successes and text me if your ass is falling off, and we'll figure out what we can do. And so she texted me, and we talked about how she could get some gas money, and all she needed to do was get back to Milestones. And so she came back about 4 months ago. She is a rock star in recovery. She is in sober living now in Lincoln City, because she knows it's not safe to go back home, where the unemployment rate sometimes reaches 80 or more %. So it's pretty bleak. And so those are the successes. We also have had women come in that went back to work for the tribe after they got clean and sober. And so, I mean, that's the stuff that excites me, is just working. I get to work one-on-one with women. I'm not their counselor. I don't do that so much anymore, but I do crisis intervention. And I also get to just come in and sit and talk and share whatever wisdom they think I have. What's lovely is they all view me as an elder. So I'm treated so respectfully.
Tayna, what does recovery mean to you today?
Oh, recovery to me anyway. I used to be, when I was growing up, a scared kid in late adolescence, really. It's not even adulthood. Because I was 19 years old when I quit using. But there was panic. And I think that panic stayed with me even that first 10 years in recovery. And I wasn't sure how I was going to feed my kid. I wasn't sure what happened if I got fired? All of these pretty irrational fears that would take over. But really from that day when I sat across reading the steps, reading the traditions, and then doing other readings and talking to people, and the fellowship and the community in a meeting settles me down. And so recovery to me means able to be, oh God, who am I? It's like I'm able to be that person who can give back. I'm able to be the person who can listen and enjoy. I have perspective. So I'm no longer crazed or anxious about losing everything. I'm grateful for what I have. I'm not wealthy. I'm not anything like that. But I know I can pay my bills. And for somebody who has money, they never understand that. My boss, the owner of the company, she doesn't get any of this. And so I try to explain it to her sometimes, and she just kind of shakes her head. But it's peace. It is serenity. And I'm not saying serenity all the time. I didn't grow up and become a nun and Mother Teresa. It's not that. It's, I don't know. I love my family first, my work second, and I enjoy them both. And I get to.
You certainly are an inspiration for women who are struggling, and you have seen and worked with so many of them over the years. And I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for your time and sharing your story of the 51-year journey from the restaurant and Toby the cook,
Yeah.
and rescuing him and all of that. I mean, everybody's story is unique, and yours is not only unique, but it's very inspirational. And I thank you for your time, and I wish you continued recovery and continued success in working with people seeking recovery, one newcomer at a time. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Tayna Pritt. She is a grateful woman in long-term recovery. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast, if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path you've chosen, and as long as you have been in continuous recovery for at least 1 year or more, please drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, legendary actor Dick Van Dyke shares his thoughts on recovery in just 30 seconds.
She has always been your baby, but when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, here is the iconic actor Dick Van Dyke, a grateful person in long-term recovery.
To be alive, to be able to see, to walk, to have houses, music, paintings, it's all a miracle. I have adopted the technique of living life from miracle to miracle. Arthur Rubinstein. There was a time in my life when I would scoff at the very idea of miracles. Which is not to say that on certain occasions I didn't hope desperately that something miraculous would come to pass. If I could get rid of my hangover by taking a few drinks without getting drunk all over again, that would have been a miracle. If I could only get bailed out, get to the airport on time, make my deadline, that would be a miracle. Out of the true miracle of my sobriety today flows a host of other miracles. I am the same person I was back then, to be sure, but I feel far differently about myself. My self-loathing has been replaced with a sense of self-respect and usefulness. There are days when I am literally astonished to be alive. When I think back to the constantly perilous existence I led and to the times I was close to death, I am filled with gratitude just to be breathing, let alone to have physical and mental capabilities. Today, I am aware that all of this has come to pass only because of the power and grace of God. That awareness for me is perhaps the greatest miracle of all. Thought for today: expect a miracle, accept a miracle.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with a friend. You can do that via social media or simply by telling somebody about it. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. If you'd like to get in touch with us, our email is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's absolutely free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Remember, if you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's that 24-hour national helpline offering free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals available as well at 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out the findsupport.gov page. It's a brand new website designed for individuals, families, and friends, including information on how to pay for treatment. Low-cost and free treatment options are included as well. Find healthcare support and also find out how to help someone else or find help for yourself. It's all in one place at findsupport.gov. Join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.